It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and could I start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Bassett Law. I think the scale of attendance today and the passion with which colleagues have spoken speaks to the importance of his advocacy and the issue. And I'm standing in today for my honourable friend, the Minister colleague, the Minister for Energy, the honourable member for Chelsea. But I'm absolutely delighted to be doing so for a number of reasons. Firstly, I come from a rural agricultural constituency that is itself facing some very substantial industrial scale infrastructure, in my case, connected to the connection of offshore wind energy and the industrialisation of rural constituencies in pursuit of noble aims of net zero is a local issue. It's a very important issue, and we've got to get that planning process right, and I've seen that myself. I'm also drive through the Cambridge to Suffolk border on the way to my constituency, and I see the Sunica proposal, and I see the signs in every field around that area and the concern locally. As the former Minister for Agri-Tech, I am passionate about the importance of this country leading the world in net zero farming and in showing how we can pioneer the technologies and the approaches for net zero agriculture. And nobody in this chamber needs to be reminded that agriculture is the next dirty industry on the block. We're cleaning the energy system, but we then have to decarbonise agriculture and transport globally. I think that's a big opportunity for this country. And as Minister for Science, Research and Innovation, Minister for Fusion, I see it as fundamental to my role to make sure we turbocharge our drive for the technological solutions that will allow the planet to grow and develop sustainably longer term. And I'm very committed to the science of the data metrics of sustainable development of both agri-metrics, so that when consumers pick up a pint of milk or a piece of British food, they are clear what its environmental footprint is. That's the best way to reward advanced progressive agricultural farming, but also carbon metrics, so that consumers can be harnessed on the journey to net zero, confident that they're making enlightened choices. That requires good science, which a number of colleagues have touched on. Yes, I'd happily give way.
I know he is a strong, thank you, Chair. I know he's a strong advocate of human rights, and he makes the point there about enlightened consumers and people wanting to know about what they are purchasing and what's in their community. So does he agree with me that we absolutely should not be installing solar panels when we know for a fact their production comes from genocidal camps where they are being exterminated, and that is the Uyghur in China?
Well, my honourable friend's made her point powerfully. I absolutely agree that we should not be supplying goods to consumers and citizens that involve torture and illegal practices. But I'm not the Consumer Affairs Minister, but I will raise that point with those who have that responsibility. What I'd like to do, Mr Walker, Sir Charles, in the time I have available, is just set out the government's policy on solar briefly, acknowledge the very important, I've got 16 important points that have been made by colleagues across the House today, summarise the process in terms of both this application and more broadly, and then make what I hope are some important and helpful undertakings as the Minister at the box. I think it's been striking today that for all the concerns raised, there's unanimity, I think, in the Chamber about the urgency of tackling the climate emergency, and I think everyone here supports the commitment to, as enshrined at COP26, to reduce global temperature increase to 1.5%. There's good science behind that, and I think it's in that spirit that many of the comments have been made, and that's why the government has adopted Carbon Budget 6, which is the world's most ambitious climate change goal to reduce emissions by 77% by 2035, which may sound a long way away, but it's rapidly drawing near, and that's compared to 1990 levels. And with limited time until that 2035, the UK's electricity supply is in urgent need of decarbonisation. That's why in the net zero strategy published last year in 21, the government committed that all UK electricity will be from low carbon sources by 2035, subject to security of supply. I'll come back to some of the changes in terms of the global markets and the Ukraine emergency and the Prime Minister's announcement of a review of energy policy at the end of my comments. I want just to touch on the benefits of solar. I think they do merit just being highlighted. It is a very flexible technology. We've, as my friend, the Honourable Member for West Suffolk, has highlighted, I think we can be proud in this country that we've deployed 99% of solar in this country at huge scale, quite small scale and high scale across this country. Solar does generate large amounts of electricity even on cloudy days and from indirect sunlight, and they work at cooler temperatures. So the carbon footprint of solar should be and is normally much lower than that for coal or gas, and most solar panel components can be recycled. And it can complement other variable generation sources like wind to balance the grid on summer days when wind speeds tend to be lower. So we see solar as key to the government's strategy to low-cost energy and decarbonisation, and large-scale solar is one of the UK's cheapest renewable generation technologies. But I'll come to where the externalities of cost may lie in my closing comments. And that's why in the net zero strategy, the government committed to sustained increase in deploying solar in the 2020s and beyond, embedded through the Contract for Difference scheme. I wanted to pick up the points that a number of colleagues have made, because they, I think, are hugely important and need to be acknowledged seriously. I think, firstly, the scale of what's being proposed in this particular case, 4,000 football pitches. I mean, this is not a small-scale development. This is not even, I think, by most people's standards, medium scale. This is huge industrial-scale development in the countryside. The fears about a Wild West, a solar rush, and the fears about the precedent in the planning system, that if one of these gets approved, then there may be a signal that we're locked into precedent. Concerns about the use of good agricultural land, which I absolutely share, and particularly in light of the Ukraine situation around food security. Concerns about the solar supply chain, both the human rights point that my honourable friends made, but also the carbon footprint point. Concerns about the metrics, the lack of metrics of sustainability, and taking into account the full externalities of the carbon footprint of developments. Concerns about the abuse of the local planning system. I've been very struck in my constituency that because this is critical national infrastructure, the views of local people, local MPs, frankly anybody locally, are very downgraded because of that critical national infrastructure. But the planning advice actually says that those local views are important. I think there's a real issue there. Specific concerns about Rutland and habitat impact, calls for a clearer national policy on tackling these policy tensions. Specific points about the impact of the Ukraine emergency on food supplies and food security and food prices. Points about the link to surreptitious approvals of effectively battery farms in inappropriate locations, fire risk, the impact on rural tourism, and the need for better co-location of generation where possible with use, and my honourable friend's point about the importance of beauty, identity and character, which is not just a magnificent ethereal concept, it also underpins tourism in the countryside. So I think some very important points that have been made and deserve to be repeated and acknowledged. Forgive me, I'm not going to list everybody, but I think Hansard will report what's been set out. I wanted just to come to the planning process, because...
Just before he goes, just very briefly,
yeah.
And I'm very grateful because I've made several interventions. On the point about the fire safety, will he take on board and comment on the need for transparency about past fires? And can I also add, because I should have done, Sir Charles, in my speech, that the member for East Cambridgeshire isn't able to speak because she's a member of government, but she wholeheartedly endorses my views and is a great campaigner for her constituency and when it comes to the Seneca plant and more broadly.
Yes, I'll happily pick that point up. He invites me, wisely perhaps given the time, to clarify that at the end of this I will be raising all the points that have been raised today with the relevant ministers, including perhaps the Minister for Fire Safety, because I think when this number of colleagues meet in a chamber, your points deserve to be heard and passed through. I just want to pick up the planning point. Colleagues may be aware, but those listening may not, that planning applications for projects below 50 megawatts are determined by the local planning system, and there have been many, many hundreds of them satisfactorily approved around the country. Projects up to 350 megawatts in Wales are devolved, and decisions are made either by local authorities or the Welsh Government, and planning in Scotland and Northern Ireland is fully, obviously, devolved. For projects over 50 megawatts in England and over 350 megawatts in Wales, planning decisions are made by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. In 2021... Very briefly.
Local authorities' declaration of climate emergency seems to be overriding the requirement to avoid developments on best and most versatile land. Shouldn't there be an absolute prohibition of solar farm developments on BMVL?
He's made his point well. Let me come to the point I was going to make about planning, which tries to deal with that. In 2021, the government set up a national infrastructure planning reform programme, bringing several government departments together. It aims to refresh how the NSIP regime works to make it faster, better and greener. The government will shortly be consulting on reform proposals later this year, and as part of this, the government is reviewing the national policy statements for energy. And it seems to me that quite a lot of what's been said today comes together into a call for a clearer national policy statement, which may be something colleagues want to raise with the Energy Minister and Planning Minister. The draft revised national policy statement for renewables does include a new section on solar projects, providing clear, specific guidance to decision makers on the impacts, for example, on local amenities, biodiversity, landscape, wildlife, land use, that must be considered when assessing planning applications. The Government plans to publish the Government's response to that consultation on the revised national policy statements shortly. Under both local and NSIP planning systems, developers must complete proper community engagement as part of the application process, and communities should and must be able to participate in the formal examination process run by the Planning Inspectorate. All large solar developers under NSIP must complete an environmental statement for any application to consider all potential impacts. And planning guidance is also clear that the effective use of land should be prioritised by focusing large-scale solar farms on previously developed and non-greenfield land. It seeks to minimise the impacts on the best and most versatile agricultural land, and it requires developers to justify using any such land and design their projects to avoid, mitigate and, where necessary, compensate for impacts. Conscious of the time I have, I think 1 minute left, Sir Charles, I wanted just to highlight that in terms of planning process, colleagues will understand that I can't comment on the specifics of this individual case because I don't want to prejudice it in any way, but I would just highlight our anticipation is that once an application is submitted to the planning inspector, it would be 15 to 18 months before it comes back to the Secretary of State after all the various consultations. And interestingly, in terms of precedent, all important in planning, only one large-scale solar application has been approved in Kent. One in Wales, at Strawberry Hill, devolved, of course, but nonetheless was turned down on the basis of the agricultural land use point. There's one, I understand, in Scunthorpe that's imminent, and obviously the Sunaker and one or two others in the pipeline. I think the point about precedent is important. We all know that when a big decision is made, it can trigger a wave of subsequent applications. Let me just close, Charles, if I may, by congratulating genuinely and thanking colleagues for coming today. I think colleagues have raised important points that I will undertake to pass on to ministers for energy, planning, farming, tourism, fire safety. And I think colleagues have made a very important case for a stronger and clearer national policy statement reflecting the situation in Ukraine, the Prime Minister's emphasis on food security and energy security, and I will undertake to make sure that the points raised today are picked up by all the relevant ministers.
Brendan.